At 6:04 p.m. on June 24, 2026, the ground beneath Caracas shook for the first time. 39 seconds later, it shook again, harder. By 6:05 p.m., a 22-story residential tower in the Altamira neighborhood had collapsed. Rescue workers were on scene within 20 minutes. They began calling into the rubble immediately. They heard voices calling back. That was Wednesday evening. By Saturday morning, 72 hours later, teams were still pulling survivors from that same pile of debris. This is the story of what happened inside the rubble of Caracas over those 72 hours. How people survived, how rescuers found them, what the search looked like from the inside, and why the window between life and death in a collapsed building is measured not in days, but in decisions made in the first few hours after the ground stopped shaking. The 72-hour rule is not a myth. It is a statistical reality derived from decades of earthquake rescue data collected across dozens of disasters. After the 1985 Mexico City earthquake, survival rates among trapped victims were analyzed against time. The probability of finding a live person in the rubble dropped sharply after the first 24 hours and again after 48. By 72 hours, the majority of people who could be found alive had been found. Those who remained were increasingly in conditions: dehydration, crush injury, secondary collapse, that reduced the probability of survival with every additional hour. After the 2010 Haiti earthquake, rescuers pulled a teenage girl from a collapsed supermarket after 15 days. A man was found alive after 27 days. These cases exist. They are documented. They are also statistical outliers that rescue teams plan around, not for. The operational reality is that the first 72 hours determine the majority of outcomes, and every decision made during that window carries weight. In Caracas, the first decision was made before the second earthquake had finished shaking. The Altamira Tower was a known address. Multiple residents had gotten out before the collapse. They stood on the street and told rescue workers arriving on scene exactly what they knew: which floors had been occupied, which apartments had been rented to families with children, which units had elderly residents who might not have been able to move quickly, which stairwell had been the most used. That information, gathered in the first 20 minutes from survivors standing in the street, shaped where rescue teams began searching. It shaped which pile of debris got the first acoustic sensor placement. It shaped which section got the first dog deployment. In earthquake rescue, information gathered in the first hour is worth more than equipment brought in on the second day. The Fairfax County Urban Search and Rescue Team landed in Valencia on Thursday evening, then drove to Caracas overnight. They arrived at the Altamira site at approximately 4 a.m. Friday. Venezuelan rescue workers had been on the rubble for 34 hours. They had already located and extracted several survivors. They had also marked locations within the debris where acoustic sensors had detected sound. Irregular tapping, which is the standard signal that trained rescuers teach trapped victims to make when they hear activity above them. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. The Fairfax team carried specialized equipment, listening devices that can detect heartbeats and breathing through several meters of reinforced concrete, cameras mounted on flexible cables thin enough to thread through gaps in rubble and provide visual confirmation of a void, a space within the collapse where a person might be alive, ground-penetrating sensors that map the density of debris and identify cavities. The team's first task was not to dig, it was to listen. They placed sensors at the marked locations and called for silence across the entire site. Dozens of workers, machinery operators, and observers went still. In the quiet, the sensors registered a response from a location in the northeast quadrant of the collapse, approximately 8 meters below the current surface of the debris. Not a tap, a voice, faint but unmistakable. The process of reaching a survivor 8 meters below a collapsed reinforced concrete building is not fast. It cannot be fast. Reinforced concrete rubble is not a pile of loose material that can be moved quickly without risk. Each piece of debris is connected to other pieces. Pulling one section without understanding its load relationships can trigger a secondary collapse, a new fall of material that can kill the rescue workers above and bury the survivor deeper. The Fairfax team uses a methodology developed across decades of deployments and refined after each major disaster. They work in a sequence. First, a structural assessment of the surface debris to identify which pieces are load-bearing and which are loose. Then, selective removal of the loose material to create a working platform. Then, careful excavation toward the target location, with constant acoustic monitoring to track any movement in the debris that might indicate instability. At each stage, the team maintains a listening watch. Every few minutes, they call for silence and check for response from the target. If the voice stops, the pace changes. If the voice continues, the pace is steady. The survivor in the northeast quadrant kept responding. Her name, they learned through shouts back and forth through the debris, was Alejandra. She was in her mid-30s. She had been in her apartment on the 14th floor when the building collapsed. She had fallen with the floor and ended up in a void created by two slabs of concrete leaning against each other, a configuration that structural engineers call a lean-to collapse, one of the more survivable collapse geometries because it creates a protected triangular space rather than a flat crush. She had water. A bottle she had grabbed when the first earthquake hit, before the second one brought the building down. She had been drinking it in small amounts. She had been tapping on the concrete wall beside her every time she heard noise above. She had been doing this for 36 hours when the Fairfax team's sensors first detected her voice. Alejandra was not the only person alive in the Altamira rubble on Friday morning. Acoustic surveys conducted by Venezuelan rescue teams in the first 24 hours had identified 5 locations across the collapse site where responses had been detected. By the time the Fairfax team arrived, 2 of those locations had been reached and the survivors extracted. One location had gone silent. The team working that section had continued for several hours and then transitioned to recovery operations, meaning they were no longer expecting to find anyone alive. 2 locations remained active, Alejandra's in the northeast quadrant, and a second signal in the western section of the collapse, closer to what had been the building's main stairwell. The western signal was weaker. It had been intermittent since Thursday afternoon. The team working that section had noted periods of response and periods of silence, which can indicate a survivor who is losing consciousness, or can indicate the limitations of acoustic detection through dense debris. They continued working. The Colombian rescue team that had crossed the border Thursday morning was operating the western section. They had been on the rubble for over 24 hours by Friday morning and were working in shifts, with team members rotating off for rest every few hours. Earthquake rescue is physically demanding in a way that makes fatigue a safety issue. A tired rescuer makes mistakes. A mistake in collapsed concrete rubble can have irreversible consequences. At 11:22 a.m. Friday, the Colombian team reached the western survivor. He was a man in his 60s named Carlos. He had been on the 6th floor. He had survived the collapse in a void beneath a collapsed concrete beam that had caught on a piece of furniture, creating just enough space. He was dehydrated. He had a broken arm from the initial fall. He was conscious. They extracted him through a tunnel the team had spent 14 hours digging, reinforcing as they went with wooden shoring to prevent the sides from collapsing inward. The tunnel was narrow enough that extraction required removing Carlos's jacket and having him exhale fully to squeeze through the tightest section. He came out into daylight at 11:22 a.m., 70 hours and 18 minutes after the building fell. The crowd that had gathered at the perimeter of the rescue site heard the confirmation call over the radio. Survivor extracted, conscious, and responded in a way that rescue workers at disaster sites describe as one of the sounds that stays with you. Not cheering exactly. Something more complicated than cheering. The sound of people who have been watching something terrible and have just seen one small thing go the other way. Alejandra came out 4 hours later. Her extraction required a different approach. The lean-to void she was in was stable, but reaching it meant working through a section of debris that included intact sections of the 14th floor slab, a thick piece of reinforced concrete that could not be broken or removed without risking the structural integrity of the void below. The Fairfax team's solution was to go around it. They excavated at an angle, creating a curved path that approached the void from the side rather than directly above. It took longer, it required more precise shoring, but it preserved the stability of the lean-to configuration that had kept Alejandra alive. She had been in the void for 74 hours and 31 minutes when they reached her. She was dehydrated. She had a head laceration that had stopped bleeding on its own. She was alert. The first thing she said to the rescuer who reached her, according to the team's account, was to ask about her neighbor from the apartment across the hall. The rescuer did not know. That information would come later. What mattered in that moment was getting Alejandra out. She was transferred to a medical team at the site perimeter, then transported to a hospital. The water she had been conserving through 74 hours in the dark had run out approximately 6 hours before she was reached. Not every story from the Altamira site ended the way Alejandra's and Carlos's did. Of the 5 locations where acoustic responses had been detected in the first 24 hours, 2 produced live extractions. 1 transitioned to recovery. 2 others, including a location where teams had worked through Thursday night, were confirmed as recovery operations by Friday afternoon. Recovery operation is the term used when rescue workers have determined that a location no longer contains living people. The work continues. The debris is still moved, still carefully excavated, but the urgency and the methodology shift. The race against the 72-hour window is over for that location. Across the broader Caracas disaster area, not just the Altamira Tower but dozens of collapse sites across the city and in La Guaira, the transition from rescue to recovery was happening unevenly and at different speeds depending on the resources available and the nature of each collapse. In the barrio neighborhoods on the hillsides above Caracas, where road damage had slowed access, rescue teams arrived later than they did in Altamira. The 72-hour window that was still open when those teams arrived in Altamira was already closing or closed in the barrios. Teams worked through sites that in some cases had not been reached until 48 hours after the earthquake, meaning they had less than a day of the statistical survival window remaining. The outcomes in those neighborhoods are still being counted. The international rescue effort that converged on Caracas in the days after the earthquake was substantial by any measure. Teams from the United States, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, El Salvador, Spain, Mexico, and Qatar were operating across multiple sites. Each team brought its own equipment, its own methodology, and its own expertise. Coordinating them required a logistics operation that the Venezuelan government, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the incoming teams themselves had to build largely in real time. That coordination is harder than it sounds. Different national teams use different radio frequencies, different terminology, different approaches to debris assessment. At a site with multiple teams working simultaneously, the risk of one team's actions affecting another team's search area is real. A secondary collapse triggered by excavation on one side of a debris pile can send vibrations through the entire structure, masking acoustic signals on the other side. The standard protocol for multi-team rescue operations calls for a unified incident command, a single coordination structure that all teams report to, that controls the sequence and location of excavation across the entire site, and that enforces the silence periods that acoustic searches require. Establishing that structure at the Altamira site, with teams arriving from different countries at different times and in different states of readiness, took most of Thursday. By Friday, the coordination was working. The silence periods were enforced. The acoustic surveys were producing usable data. The excavation sequences were controlled. By Saturday, the transition from rescue to recovery was nearly complete across the major sites. Teams that had been working in shifts for 72 hours began standing down. Equipment was consolidated. The count of confirmed extractions, the number of people brought out alive, was finalized for each site. At Altamira, that number was 11. 11 people, out of a 22-story building that had been fully occupied on a Wednesday evening, were brought out alive from the rubble. The building had housed hundreds of residents. The difference between the 11 who survived and the others is partly geometry, the lean-to voids and other survivable collapse configurations that formed in specific locations, and partly time, and partly the decisions made in the first hour by the survivors standing on the street who told rescue workers exactly where to look. The science of survival in a collapsed building comes down to 3 factors. The first is void formation. When a building collapses, the debris does not form a uniform flat crush. Structural elements, beams, columns, slabs, fall and intersect in ways that create protected spaces. The size and stability of those spaces determine whether a person caught in them survives the initial collapse. A lean-to configuration where 2 slabs meet at an angle creates a triangular space. A pancake collapse, where floors fall flat onto each other, creates almost no space. The Altamira Tower, based on the collapse pattern visible from outside, produced a mix of both configurations in different sections. The second factor is physiology. A person who survives the initial collapse has a window of physiological survivability that depends on their injuries, their access to air and water, and their ability to manage their own condition. Dehydration is the primary threat in the short term. A person without water who is injured and stressed can deteriorate rapidly. A person with water, even a small amount managed carefully, can survive significantly longer. Alejandra's bottle of water, grabbed instinctively when the first earthquake hit, was the difference between her timeline and a shorter one. The third factor is communication. A survivor who can signal, by tapping, by calling, by any means, dramatically increases the probability of being found within the 72-hour window. A survivor who is unconscious or too injured to signal may be in a perfectly survivable void that rescue teams pass over because the acoustic sensors return nothing. Teaching people what to do if they are trapped, tap 3 times, pause, tap 3 times, is one of the lowest cost, highest impact pieces of earthquake preparedness that exists. It requires no equipment. It requires only that people know to do it. Alejandra knew. She had heard it somewhere. She did not remember where. She tapped on the concrete wall beside her every time she heard noise above for 36 hours until the sensors heard her back. The 72-hour window closed across Caracas on Saturday evening. Rescue operations formally transitioned to recovery across the major sites. The international teams that had been on the ground since Thursday began the process of demobilization, packing equipment, coordinating transport, preparing after-action reports that would be sent to their respective agencies, and eventually contribute to the body of knowledge that shapes how the next rescue operation is conducted. The Fairfax County team, before leaving the Altamira site, conducted a debrief with Venezuelan rescue workers who had been on the rubble since the first hour. They reviewed what had worked, what had been slow, what coordination failures had cost time. That debrief is standard procedure. It is how the knowledge from one disaster gets incorporated into the response to the next one. In Venezuela, that knowledge now includes specifics about the fault system, the building stock, the collapse patterns, the coordination challenges, and the survival stories, including Alejandra's, including Carlos's, that will be studied by engineers and rescue planners in the months ahead. The earthquake lasted 39 seconds. The rescue operation lasted 72 hours. The recovery will last much longer. For the 11 people brought out alive from the Altamira Tower, and for the other survivors extracted from sites across Caracas and La Guaira in the days after June 24th. What comes next is hospitals, rehabilitation, and the process of rebuilding lives in a city that is itself rebuilding. For the rescue workers, Venezuelan, American, Colombian, Brazilian, and from a dozen other countries, what comes next is going home and waiting for the next call. Subscribe if you want to follow the Venezuela earthquake recovery, the ongoing reconstruction, and the engineering questions that the Caracas collapses have raised about how cities prepare for disasters they know are coming. The next video on your screen covers the infrastructure failures that made the Caracas collapses possible, the building codes, the enforcement gaps, and the 126 years of quiet on a fault line that everyone knew was not dead. Stay informed. There is a particular kind of silence that rescue workers enforce on a collapse site. Everyone stops simultaneously. Machinery cuts off. Conversations end mid-sentence. The incident commander calls it over the radio with a single word: quiet. Within seconds, a disaster site operating at full intensity goes completely still. In that stillness, the sensors listen. Not for shouts. Trapped survivors are often too weak to sustain them. For taps. The rhythmic, intentional percussion of someone who has learned that making noise in a pattern is more effective than making noise continuously. The sensors the Fairfax County team carried can distinguish a tap from structural settling, from machinery on adjacent sites, from groundwater. They flag irregular rhythmic signals and present them to a human operator for evaluation. When an operator confirms the signal sounds intentional, that location becomes a priority. At the Altamira site, 5 locations were flagged in the first sensor sweep Thursday morning, 5 targets, 36 hours into a 72-hour window. The barrio neighborhoods above Caracas present the hardest part of the rescue story to tell. In Altamira, resources were substantial from the start. A known address, teams on scene within 20 minutes, international support within 48 hours. In the hillside barrios, the situation was different. Road damage compressed the already narrow window. In some neighborhoods, the first rescue teams did not arrive until Thursday afternoon, more than 20 hours after the earthquake, with whatever equipment could be transported over damaged roads. The barrio buildings that collapsed were mostly informal construction, unreinforced masonry, small footprints, built on steep terrain with poor foundation conditions. The debris was different from Altamira. The void geometries were different. Rescue workers worked through those sites with the tools they had and the time remaining. The full accounting of outcomes across the barrio neighborhoods will take weeks. The roads that blocked access are still being cleared. The work continues. The dogs arrived at the Altamira site Thursday morning, brought in by Venezuelan civil defense along with their handlers. Search and rescue dogs trained for structural collapse work differently from the acoustic sensors. They are not listening for sound, they are following scent. The chemical compounds released by a living human body, which travel through gaps and debris that no camera can reach and no sensor can navigate. A trained dog can detect a survivor through several meters of rubble if there is any air pathway between the void and the surface. The dogs work the perimeter of the Altamira collapse in a systematic grid pattern, their handlers watching for the alert behavior, the change in posture, the focused attention, the specific body language that indicates the dog has found something. When a dog alerts, the handler marks the location and the team notes it alongside the acoustic data. At one location on the southern face of the collapse, a dog alerted repeatedly over a section of debris that the acoustic sensors had not flagged. The handlers reported it. The team assigned to that section conducted a targeted acoustic survey with a directional sensor aimed at the dog's alert zone. It returned nothing. The team faced a decision. Dog alerts carry weight. They are reliable enough that the protocol requires follow-up. But the acoustic survey had returned no signal, and resources on the site were finite. Every crew hour spent excavating an unconfirmed location is a crew hour not spent on a confirmed one. They excavated. 3 hours of work to create a probe hole through which a camera could be threaded. The camera found a void, empty. The dog had been correct that something was there. The void existed, but whoever had been in it had not survived. The acoustic sensor had been correct too. No one alive was making sound in that location by the time the survey was conducted. The two pieces of information, together, told the complete story. The sensor and the dog are not alternatives to each other. They answer different questions. The dog finds where life was or is. The sensor determines which answer applies. The official count of survivors extracted from collapsed structures across Caracas and La Guaira, as compiled by Venezuelan civil defense through Saturday evening, stood at 47. 47 people pulled from rubble that had fallen on them Wednesday evening. 47 people for whom the sequence of void formation, physiological survival, acoustic signal, and rescue response had aligned within the 72-hour window. The number of people who did not survive, who were in the rubble and were not reached in time, or who were reached but could not be extracted, or who survived the initial collapse but did not survive the waiting, is part of the death toll that is still being finalized. The confirmed dead as of Saturday stood at 188, with the USGS model suggesting the final number could be many times higher once all sites are fully cleared. 47 survivors out of a disaster that the USGS modeling suggests may have killed thousands is a number that can be read two ways. 47 people are alive who otherwise would not be. Each of them is a complete story. Each of them is a family that received a different call than the one they feared. Each of them spent some number of hours in the dark, in a space they did not choose, doing what they could do, tapping, conserving water, staying still, staying conscious, and were found. The other reading is that 47, against the scale of what the modeling suggests, is a number shaped by everything that went wrong before the earthquake. The buildings that were not built to code, the inspections that did not happen, the retrofitting that was never funded, the 126 years of preparation that a city on an active fault line did not fully complete. Both readings are true. They are not in conflict. They are the same disaster, seen from different distances. The earthquake lasted 39 seconds. In those 39 seconds, the ground released energy that had been accumulating since 1900. Buildings failed in ways that codes written after 1967 were designed to prevent. People ended up in voids in the dark. And a rescue operation involving teams from more than a dozen countries began with a survivor standing on a street in Altamira, telling a rescuer which floors had been occupied. 47 people came out. Subscribe if you want to follow the recovery, the ongoing search operations, the reconstruction planning, and the engineering accountability questions that the Caracas collapses have raised. The next video covers why those buildings failed in the first place, the codes, the enforcement gaps, and what Venezuela knew about this fault line for over a century before Wednesday evening. Stay informed.